ordinary Labour Party members and spent 2 years staring Blair in the face. It was a very odd experience, I can tell you. And prior to that, I had been a Labour councillor in Islington, and during that time I'd been selected to fight the parliamentary seat of Leeds North East. But for various reasons, Blair decided that socialists like me should not have the opportunity of being parliamentary candidates or MPs, and I was properly democratically selected by the Labour Party members of Leeds North East, but Blair then blocked it through the National Executive Committee. It was one of his early moves, a bit like abolishing Clause 4. It was him sending a message to the membership that we are not having any more socialists in Parliament. We may have Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Benn. I wouldn't compare myself to Tony Benn, but we're not. The door is now closed. We're not having any more. I also spent a short time in the Socialist Alliance in about 2001-2002, which was something that started off with a great deal of hope, I think, but ended up with a great deal of despair, and I learned some lessons from that. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Does the left need a new party? Does the left need a party at all? Should we have any sort of role to play in elections? There are plenty of struggles, political struggles going on outside of the electoral forum. We've just seen the RMT on strike, a strike that had a lot of public, popular support, despite Boris Johnson's attacks on Bob Crow and the RMT. We've seen quite a lot of trade union disputes, Grangemouth, firefighters' disputes, and so forth. And of course, there's all the other sort of protests that we've come to see over the last few years. Student protests, occupations, the sort of protest gathering that Occupy outside St Paul's Cathedral 3 years ago represented, environmental protests, no dash for gas, going up in power stations and so forth. Do we need a left party? We've also seen a resurgence of feminism with things like slut walks, and the fact that the word feminist, I think, has come back into popular use, and a lot of young women are characterising themselves as feminists. They're embracing that word, something that wasn't happening in the 1990s when it was seen as being a very old-fashioned word. And LGBT rights are almost mainstream. Look at all the fuss about Russia and Sochi, the fact that mainstream media is making a fuss about gay rights around the Winter Olympics. So do we need any sort of electoral party at all? Or are people, mainly young people, more responsive to the sort of Russell Brand view of the world? I imagine most of you saw Russell Brand interviewed by Platzman. Are people nodding? I looked up, rather than watching, I looked up the New Statesman article that he wrote, and he said, "I've never voted. Like most people, I'm utterly disenchanted by politics. Like most people, I regard politicians as frauds and liars, and the current political system as nothing more than a bureaucratic means for furthering the augmentation and advantages of economic elites." But with the exception of that first sentence about "I've never voted," I think most of us in this room would agree with him. He goes on, "I don't vote because to me it seems like a tacit act of compliance. I know my grandparents fought in 2 world wars and 1 World Cup," proposition, can it, "so that I'd have the right to vote. Well, they were conned. As far as I'm concerned, there is nothing to vote for. I feel it is a far more potent political act to completely renounce the current paradigm than to participate in even the most trivial and tokenistic manner by obediently crossing in a little box." So, is he right? Should we just refrain from the electoral process altogether, concentrate on the different sort of disputes that are out there, which is kind of what he was saying? He goes on to talk about environmentalism and so forth. Does he stand for a particular sort of zeitgeist that young people in particular relate to and have that disenchantment? I have to say, he talks about environmental protests, but he's not entirely keen on those as well, because he says in a sort of muttered aside, well, Stop the War marches didn't exactly stop the war, and those of us who were on the Stop the War marches 10 years ago knew perfectly well that they didn't stop the war, but they did a lot of other very important things, even if they didn't change Blair's mind. The Russell Brand attitude is routinely associated in the mainstream press with moans about low turnout at election time, and it seems to become a sort of assumed fact that there is now a very low turnout in election time. The turnout is decreasing slightly in general elections, but it's still, the last general election was 65%, which is down from turnouts in 1979 when Thatcher was elected. It was 76%. But what's most interesting about turnout is that the two low turnouts for general elections were in 2001 and in 2005. And of course both those general elections were elections that the Tories were not going to win. Everybody knew that Labour was going to win, both times round, 2001, 2005. Unlike 1997, when there was a relatively high turnout, there was no great cheer about the Labour government getting re-elected in 2001, 2005, but it was clearly better than the Tories coming into government. We know that because we've had the Tories in government for the last 3 years. So there was a low turnout in those two elections, and then a somewhat higher turnout, 65% last time round. The other thing that these commentators saying, oh, we're all apathetic now, do is they point to turnout amongst young people, 18 to 25-year-olds. And again, when you look at the figures, there is certainly something of a decline in turnout amongst young people. It was 67% in 1997, and it was 51%, nearly 52% in 22. So there is a clear pattern that young people vote less often than old people. But I don't take from that we're all apathetic about politics, or even apathetic about voting. I take from that what we are cynical about is the lack of choice that we have from the three mainstream political parties, and the very fact that people didn't bother to vote so much in 2001 and 2005, when they knew that it didn't really matter, and there wasn't really, that there was a choice, but it wasn't that much of a choice, seems to me to confirm that. I also think that when push comes to shove, when it is about the Tories winning, then you do get turnout. And just round here in 2010, two safe seats, Hackney North and Hackney South, are two safe Labour seats. But on the evening of the general election, there were queues at polling stations. There were people who were turning out overwhelmingly to vote Labour. They didn't particularly need to because it was a safe seat, but they were saying to the people taking numbers on the door, we've got to vote against the Tories. The Tories are going to get in this time, and we've got to vote against the Tories. As it happened in Hackney, it didn't matter. David Cameron got in anyway, but that was the political motivation. So I think voting does still matter, and I think that the left has to engage in it. Besides anything else, voting is a form of political activity that most people do. Most people don't go on strike, abseil down power stations, sit outside St Paul's Cathedral in tents, or, more conventionally, go on demonstrations and marches and so forth. A number of us do, but not enough of us do. But voting, certainly at general election time, is the one time when at least half of those people who are registered to vote turn out to vote. They tend to think about what they are voting and why they are voting. They are prepared to have people knock on their doors and have some sort of political discussion. You don't necessarily want to put it too high. Not everybody is hugely engaged, but it is once every 5 years. It is seen as the opportunity for ordinary people to express a political voice, and the left can't just disengage from that and say that we're going to be involved in all sorts of other forms of political protest, but not actually in the one that most people see as the most important time for them to voice their opinion once every 5 years when they get to vote for a government. And the last reason why it matters is because government does make a difference. And although we have very little choice between the Tories on the one hand and the Labour Party on the other, there is enough of a choice. We know that because we spent the last 3 years living, nearly 4 years living under a Tory government. And I would still rather have lived under the new Labour government, which I didn't like, I didn't support, I thought did some dreadful things, not least invading other people's countries, but did some dreadful things to the working class and to public services as well. But it's still, on the lesser evilism analysis, it's still better than a Tory government. Have I said that?
You shouldn't have said that.
Right. I'm going to make 2 more points. The first is, well, why not the Labour Party? If voting and engaging in the political process is so important, then why not the Labour Party? And as Rachel said when she introduced me, I was a member of the Labour Party. I was a very active member of the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Party hundreds of years ago, back in 1979, because as far as I was concerned, that was the way of political activity and starting to change the world. I didn't have huge illusions about the Labour Party, but it was an alliance of Social Democrats and Socialists. I was on the socialist end of it, and there was broad agreement about the need to redistribute wealth and so forth. How quickly one did it, how one did it, there was an awful lot of disagreement about. But generally, there was a political consensus that inequality was unfair, that wealth should be redistributed, and of course the Labour Party was the political voice of the trade unions. That's what it was set up to be. It has now changed, and my view is it has changed forever, that we're not going to get back any sort of old Labour Party. And it's changed in 2 ways. The first is that Thatcher won. Thatcher's mantra, neoliberal mantra of there is no alternative to neoliberalism, there is no alternative to aggressive capitalism, came into the Labour Party through Tony Blair and his acolytes. They embraced neoliberalism wholeheartedly, and in a sense I think that was probably Thatcher's greatest victory, was convincing the opposition of her beliefs. So the Labour Party became neoliberal. That would be fine if there was an opportunity to change it. But at the same time as it changed its ideology to a neoliberal ideology, it changed what democratic structures it had. And again, one can't be too nostalgic about the old Labour Party. It wasn't that democratic. But there was still, theoretically, the opportunity for somebody to go along to Hackney North Labour Party, move a resolution, get it through Hackney North Labour Party, get it up to the Labour Party conference, and if you convinced enough people, getting it adopted as Labour Party policy. That cannot happen anymore. Since Blair, he changed the whole structures, he uprooted them, he replaced them with a policy-making structure that Ken Livingstone many years ago called said was like a demented octopus. And the idea that a party member can, through democratic structures, have any influence has simply gone from the Labour Party. And you can see that from the leadership of the Labour Party. Don't get me wrong, John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn, a handful of other left MPs are excellent socialists, and I wish them well. The people who are running the Labour Party have been brought up in that neoliberal ideology. They were youngsters under Blair. They have been brought up entirely in the political bubble. They went from university straight into political jobs at Westminster and then straight into safe seats. And they cannot conceive of an alternative to neoliberalism, nor do they want to conceive of that. They don't regard themselves as accountable to ordinary Labour Party members. They certainly don't regard themselves as accountable to the working class, to people who deliver public services, and heaven forbid, they certainly do not regard themselves as accountable to the trade unions, who are the trade unions who are still funding the party, but who have absolutely no voice in the party whatsoever, and even less come March and come the proposals that Miliband wants to get through the special conference. So I don't have any hope that the Labour Party is going to start engaging in socialist principles around civil liberties, redistribution of wealth, defence of public services, or any sort of progressive human rights foreign policy. It is not possible to change the Labour Party because it doesn't have democratic structures. What about the Green Party? Caroline Lucas is an excellent MP. I would put her there with Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. Some of my best friends are Green Party members, so forth. But it's not a socialist party. It doesn't claim to be a socialist party. It has a mixed record in local government, both in Brighton, and I remember when the Greens in Leeds went into coalition with the Tories, and I don't see how anybody who calls himself progressive could possibly do that. So what we come to is the left. Outside the Labour Party, there are a couple already of small left parties. The question is, why found another small left party, if that's what we're doing with left unity? And let me just finish by making a number of points about why I think we have to do that. The first is, of course, we don't want to be a small left party. You may start as a small left party, but the idea is that we want to get bigger than that. If we're still a small left party in 20 years' time, then Communism will have failed. There's no doubt about that. The second reason why I think we need a left party is I've been talking about how elections matter and how it is important to be intervening in the electoral process and giving the electorate the opportunity to vote for progressive values around defending public services. But I don't think any party should be purely an electoral party. I think any party that actually wants to gain votes and wants to be respected by the electorate also has to be a very active campaigning party around local issues, opposing hospital closures, organising against the privatisation of the NHS, all sorts of other local progressive public service issues. And I don't think that you have any respect from the electorate when you knock on their door once every 5 years if you haven't also been out on the streets campaigning about local and national issues. So any left party, it seems to me, has to be both electoral and campaigning, and the two go hand in hand, and you cannot have the one without the other. The third thing that I am very clear about is that any left party has to be absolutely and rigorously democratic, transparent and accountable to its members. And there has been a bit of a problem with left parties in England and in Scotland that have relied too much on charismatic and unaccountable leaders, and that has not been helpful for the left, in my view. One of the things I like about left unity is the absolute emphasis and rigour about democracy, transparency and accountability. The other thing I like about left unity is the statement of principles that was adopted at the founding conference, and that statement of principles, a lot of hard work went into putting it together. Nobody actually got exactly the perfect document that they had written because it got amended, and that was a process of democracy and people thinking through the different issues and coming up with a series of votes that produces a statement of principles. But I really like the fact that it goes out of its way to say we are socialist and we are feminist and we are environmentalist. And I think that these days you can't just use the word socialist. I think that it's very important to be out there proclaiming the words, the principles, feminist and environmentalist, with exactly the same emphasis as we do about socialism. The next thing, the last thing I want to say about small left parties, as it were, is patience. Because I think the history of left parties in the last decade or so in England, Wales and Scotland has been a wish for quick fulfilment, quick results. And the fact is that if you are serious about elections, you have to be in there for the long term, for the long haul, because the public takes time to get to know what you might call a brand, a party name. You can't change the party name every 2 years because you're a bit dissatisfied with bad election results and think that if you rebrand it, then the public will suddenly come flocking to you. That may work in capitalism, it may work in advertising. It does not work for electoral politics. It is a long, hard slog. And we can see that when we look at the Greens. The Greens have been around first as the Ecology Party and then as the Green Party for about 40 years. They had what everybody considered to be a main breakthrough in 1999 in the European elections when they got 15% of the vote. They didn't get any elected representatives. And then suddenly their vote declined again. And it wasn't until the late 90s that they started getting anything like respectable figures. They also started getting, through proportional representation, representatives on the London Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, and the European Parliament. And it was only as a result of that very hard work and getting in at the bottom of the list, getting the 5% vote, 7% vote that gets you elected representatives, that they were able to start to make the impact that they have made. And they're not yet. And we don't talk about the four mainstream political parties, do we? We don't include the Greens with that. They're still electorally on the margins. It is a long, hard slog, and the idea that you're going to have instant gratification and overwhelming election results in a year's time, I think is, if anybody thinks that, then they've got that wrong. You have to do this thing with a great deal of patience and know that you are in for a long term, for the long term. The very last thing I want to say is that those are reasons why starting up what is currently a small left party is a daunting task. But I do think it's a necessary task. And I took a lot away from the founding conference on the 30th of November. It was a difficult conference. It was dealing with the Constitution and the Statement of Principles. That was never going to be, there weren't great orators there exhorting everybody to go out and fight for the chance to get into government or anything like that. It was never going to be one of those huge politically inspiring moments. But what it was democratic. What it was diverse. Nobody walked out, which is a first as far as I can see when you're trying to put together a set of constitutional principles. There were sharp debates, but everybody did it with good humour and did not take their bat away, as it were. And I think that there is a lot of hard work that went into both the foundation of the party culminating in that day, and then the work that people on the National Council have been doing since then. So I see Left Unity as very diverse, rigorously democratic, and something that I think a third of its active members attended on the 30th of November. They sat through a difficult day, and they came out with a good decision, a good set of principles, and a good constitution. So I do take heart from that. We have a lot to do, comrades, if we're going to start making a difference electorally, but I think we have a good beginning.